Hi, I'm Sam Candy from Candy Consulting and welcome to Sustain Talks. Today, I'm joined by Glenn Thorsen, Head of Partnerships at Thrust Carbon, and we are going to delve deeper into calculating your carbon. Hi, Glenn, how are you?
Hey, Sam, I'm doing very well, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here. Really looking forward to this chat. People always ask questions about calculating carbon and how they do it and what it is. But why don't you start by giving a real deeper introduction into who you are and into Thrust Carbon?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, I'm Glenn Thorsen and Head of Partnerships at Thrust Carbon. I guess a brief bit of background about myself. I've got a range of experience throughout travel technology, and a range of different startups in particular in the emerging tech space when it comes to the business travel industry as a wider space, and also meetings and events and some other sort of spin-out categories that have a lot of different hooks into that environment. So that's what sort of makes my mind tick. And one of the things that brought me to the Thrust Carbon adventure over a year and a half ago now. So Thrust Carbon is, we're almost 2 years since we launched. We're a green tech startup, and we deliver emissions intelligence solutions to a range of corporate clients and partners with a particular focus on the travel industry.
Great. And it's been going for how long now?
So just under 2 years. We launched sort of right at the end of 19, start of 20. We were a little bit secretive at the start, so you wouldn't have seen us probably in the first half of that year, but we've been obviously doing a lot in the last 12, getting on towards 18 months in particular, really trying to move the dialogue forwards and be as visible as possible in everything we do.
And it feels like actually the last year it's taking a bit of a flight itself, and things have really picked up and everyone wants to have the conversation, right? Do you get that feeling?
Absolutely. I mean, for those out there that have been looking at sustainability since even before the pandemic and 2019 and before that, it's definitely a dialogue that's been going on in many respects. But the last 18 months in particular has led to a much more widespread, I don't want to go and use the term mainstream, but for want of a better term, than exactly that. It's definitely become more commonplace to have the goals, or at least to start thinking about what the goals should be. And to your point, that's definitely something which has been seen. So the industry, not just corporate travel now, but everything that touches into sustainability, people want to be able to reset with a greener focus. We've proven to ourselves that we can do things remotely and have a drastic reduction in everything almost that ties into that travel and emissions piece. So now we can take a more tangible approach to how do we continue to do that, but with a greener focus, because it's not just as wanton as saying we go out there and do everything as a one-day trip. We can start to balance and prioritize when we actually have those emissions and how we manage them.
Yeah. So with Thrust Carbon, do you just measure travel, and what travel do you measure? Talk more about that.
So we actually don't just measure travel. We do measure pretty much everything that you can measure when it comes to emissions. But in the context of what we deliver, how we deliver it, and who we work with, we have taken a very specific approach right now to specialize on travel. And there's a range of reasons for that. One being that travel actually has a huge wealth of data. So there is an incredible opportunity to actually be much more detailed than the typical sort of average calculations that we see and hear about. And that's not to say, obviously, that those average calculations are wrong. They're frameworks and they're there for a reason. But it is entirely possible and reasonable to go well beyond that and become really specific when you look at the travel program. So that's why we do things the way we do them. And we have that approach for travel right now. As far as the other categories, it is something that we can do. And again, the data is there to support it, but we want to scale our team in line with releasing those types of functionality points, rather than trying to tell everyone, hey, we do everything, and then have to convince everybody of all those pieces.
Yeah.
We want to continue to take that real specific focus on travel where we can really make a difference.
Okay. And I mean, with Thrust Carbon, like for the past, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, maybe even more, when people have measured their carbon through their travel, it's really been just a point to point. It's you go a little bit deeper than that, so it's almost a bit more accurate, isn't it?
We do, yes. So as I said, there's a huge wealth of data in the travel space. And I guess to your point, the numbers that we often see is that average from a flight perspective. And it is very often just an airport to airport, like you said, point to point calculation. And that is where frameworks like DEFRA and EPA and other national agencies have their methodologies set, because for those of us that aren't specialists and haven't been doing this for years, it isn't fair to go out and then say overnight, you have to suddenly be able to calculate right down to a last gram fuel burn, because that's a very, very difficult task. And in most cases, it's actually not even possible yet today. So we have those frameworks and we have them for a reason. But ultimately, it is possible and valuable to go well beyond that. So when we look at flights, for example, you can go out there and reference metrics around the carrier themselves, the types of load factors, cargo and passenger splits that they have. We can reference things like the equipment level that's applied on each flight, so the aircraft that's in use, the engine type. And it is possible to look at things like the fuel volume that is consumed. So we are moving forward there. And those are all points that we actually calculate as a standard. So when our clients and partners provide a typical travel itinerary report, we're able to actually apply all of those metrics without it having to be a really long-winded process taking months or weeks and costing ridiculous amounts of money, because the data is there to support it at scale. So yeah, that's the approach we take. And then the second point to that is it is very common when you look at things like annual reports and the sustainability piece, which is most cases still not a very long section. It tends to be getting longer for most companies, but very often it's still very normal to see the asterisk on scope 3 emissions that business travel is only calculating around 50 to 70% of spend. It may only be calculating flights, and for flights, it's applying that DEFRA or EPA average. So something's being done, but as far as the information we have, it's actually very little. So we calculate for all the travel categories: hotel stays, meetings and events, ground transportation, even things like ferry and public transport and rail as well. So you can calculate for all those categories, and you can do it with data that your program already has. So those are obviously some of the opportunities that we bring to the conversation.
And some of it can literally be done at the push of a button, you know, as long as you've got, is it the flight number and the date that you need to, at the push of a button, say, right, we know that was this aircraft, and how's it done?
So if you have the right mechanics in place, then yes, it can be pretty much as easy as that. There is still a lot of work that needs to go on behind the scenes. So to work with the flight number, for example, you need to cross-match and reference with things like industry scheduling data and a few other bits and pieces. But obviously, if that's your focus, like with us, for example, that is our only focus. We're not trying to become a hybrid sustainable TMC or a booking tool that happens to also know about sustainability. We want to remain sustainability specialists and then leverage our APIs to make that available in as many environments as possible. So exactly to your point, with our solution, we really can, with date and flight number and a couple of other information points like the travel class, for example, go out and generate that really detailed calculation with just that single click of a button or single push of an API call for a partner, for example.
We've had this conversation before, but it can sometimes be, because you're doing it more accurately, the difference can be so damaging that, you know, almost like, I mean, you said before 50% of travel, but it can be millions of tons of carbon, right? Because it's so wrong.
It could be, yes, depending on obviously the context of the business and a lot of things. I mean, some of the things that we see, just as a general sort of insight piece, is one of the areas that's still quite common to be discounted when it comes to taking calculations from either a partner or a solution layer that doesn't specialize in it, is that some fundamental metrics may not be applied. So in flights, for example, there's a factor called radiative forcing. Without going into obviously all the details and science behind it, radiative forcing is the index that's applied to denote the effect of an emission taking place up at a certain altitude rather than at ground level. So because the air is thinner, much like we would have learned in school when we heard about things like the greenhouse effect, because it's thinner up at the top, the same amount of emission that happens at ground level will have a much higher impact on the environment. So there's a multiplying factor called radiative forcing. Currently, that factor is set at a UN certified level of 1.9, and that's what's applied by most environmentally focused solutions or consultants. Now, other solution layers or sort of data sets you might get, which aren't really providing the sustainability number as a core value, but they've taken it from somewhere else, or they've applied something from a few years back and they haven't updated it, they often won't apply radiative forcing. So sometimes you can go in and do a really specialized analysis, and you may see the emissions almost double. And it can be things like that. So we often say to clients and partners that it's not unreasonable for those numbers to change. It's, in fact, we're expecting them to continue to change, because next year new science might emerge that means we may increase that radiative forcing factor. So all of our emissions will technically increase. But it's important to be transparent about, we found this, so now we're changing it, because it's okay to get better. You don't know what you don't know. And most clients 3 years ago, they didn't have either the access to these types of specialized solutions, or they didn't have the buy-in in the business to go and invest in them. So that is why we're expecting to see these types of things continue to emerge.
Yeah, great. Once someone has calculated their carbon, what next? I mean, you have other products, right?
We do, yeah. So the one side of what we deliver is the fundamental thrust calculator, getting the insights across all categories of travel. And then we offer a range of different ways to engage and develop from there. So one of the pillars of our solution is what we call Thrust Engage, which is where we start to deliver these insights back to travelers and the travel program itself at various points where it makes sense and it can have an impact. So we start to visualize these differences on travel categories and choices of transport when the traveler is actually trying to plan their trip, making their booking. So our APIs are accessible, which means it's possible to bring those into a range of different booking tools. But we can also support things like carbon budgeting, which can be visualized in dashboards. So again, travelers can start to see and understand, how could I have reduced the emissions by still having a level of travel? We do analysis layers for things like repeat city visits as well. So you can really go in and have a real immediate impact on the emissions of the travel program without fundamentally preventing travel, but transitioning how it happens. So understanding if a team or an individual traveler is visiting the same city multiple times in a single month, perhaps we could extend the length of trips so that you can visit multiple clients on the same trip rather than having all these 1 or 2 day trips, and then drastically reduce the emissions on the flight side while comparatively having a smaller increase on the hotel side. So you're still getting the benefit of obviously those in-person visits when you need them, but you're not doing it in a way that has the same impact.
Yeah, and finally, at the last resort, once you've calculated and once you've reduced, and obviously we do have to still travel for business to have a sustainable economy, but then at the last point you have an offsetting program too.
We do. So our APIs also cover sustainability projects. So it ranges really from, because we don't invest in the projects ourselves, we don't operate them ourselves. So what we surface is actually direct access through to globally certified projects. And the pricing that we surface is set by them as well. So it's not something that we influence. We don't go in and dictate how they need to price that or anything like that. It's a purely transparent marketplace. And to your point, it's about giving the clients and the partners access to that final part when they've made the understanding, they've put their measurements in place. If we think of the traditional carbon management hierarchy, the funnel, as we move down where we're offsetting is at the bottom, then it's about giving them that access, but in the same environment that it makes sense. So when the travel administrator or whoever is managing that part of the program can see the quarterly or monthly emissions, they also have access to essentially allocate project contributions right there and then. And from our side as well, it's about supporting the diversity there. So we don't just have a fixed portfolio, which is our portfolio. We don't just have one project. Everything is accessible and can be chosen by the client. So whether that's geographic placement from a global perspective or even project categories. So we support everything from the first level sort of reforestation and afforestation projects right through to things like carbon capture, soil sequestration, renewable energy certificates and project contributions. And we are also exploring partnerships on the sustainable aviation fuel side as well. So Brilliant. We can start to visualize and provide some access at that level. So really trying to provide everything that is relevant for every stage of the journey, for every type of client.
Yeah, there's so much development there. I think it's just going to get better and better as time goes on. Who's doing it well? Is there companies you can give examples of where they're, really sort of standing out?
Well, I mean, one example that's often held up is Microsoft. They're obviously very visible. Now, I think the important thing to recognize is that there's not really any single recipe for what's right, because some companies like the Microsofts and Boston Consulting of the world are able to go out and make direct agreements and contributions on the sustainable fuel level. They have enough travel volume for that to really have an impact, even for their own activity, and that's fantastic. I think it's important to recognize them, but not hold them up in a way that other companies have to feel that they can't make a difference because they can't go to the same extent. Because ultimately, 95% of the businesses out there can't go to that level. It's a very, very small group that can play in those courts. But they are obviously helping to move things forward. They're paving the way. They're helping to provide access for others. So those are definitely important cases to recognize. But on the other side, I think anyone that's really taking steps to both analyze and look internally. And I know somebody else that you've had on the program as well, Sarah from Fly Green Alliance.
Yeah.
She's doing a lot of work as well, trying to make the whole accessibility of SAF more open, which is really important because that big bracket of mid to mass market companies, they're going to look at those deals and think, we can't do that. So can we make a difference? And I think that's probably the most important thing to veer away from. I don't think there's any company that we could hold up and say they're the one to follow. Everyone needs to find their own version to move forwards, because it isn't just a fixed sort of one approach works and nothing else does. Yeah,
and I think the SMEs, they, 95% of companies are SMEs, right? So they need to, that's a big part of making a difference. So if they don't think, oh, we're not big enough to make a difference, that's completely wrong. They really can be part of change, right?
Absolutely. And I think when the immediate term is exhausted, that's going to be the bracket that makes the biggest difference. I mean, yes, it is, as always is the case, it is the small percentage that makes the biggest difference in the big volume perspectives. But to get that critical mass movement to support some of these various innovative startups that are out there, we've even got programs in the UK like an initiative called Gentle Farming, which is a platform where you're able to purchase soil sequestration certificates that support local farmers. Again, a fantastic initiative, because a lot of the efforts that they're actually doing day to day, they are capturing carbon, and they're not providing certificates at a scale that interests the large corporates like a Microsoft or somebody else, but they are able to support certificates to things like 1,000 tons or a few hundred tons, just something which is very accessible for that big mid-market segment. So I think it's really important to try and make sure that that's always visible, and that the companies that are in that bracket can sort of take that step and realize that we don't have to do a big sweeping revamp of everything, but we can actually engage immediately, and we can be part of making that difference.
Yeah, great. It's been a strange old year and a half, but what have been your biggest learnings over this past year and a half?
Gosh, that's a tough one to put in such a short perspective, but ultimately I think the fact that there's a lot more appetite and willingness to engage than I think most of us realize. And for an industry that obviously does get a lot of rap on the fact that, yes, there's a responsibility from an emissions perspective. There's obviously the sort of brush being painted around, well, all the one-day trips and that one-ton approach to just traveling for the sake of traveling. But I think that the last 6 months in particular have definitely shown that there is a real willingness to engage. And I think that the next 6 months are going to be so critical there to see how can we take that a step further and apply it, because there's been so many webinars, so many sessions that people have engaged in virtually and sort of talking about how we can move this agenda forward and not just pay it lip service as we've done before. And I think there's plenty of indications, partnerships emerging, startups coming through, corporates making big ambitious steps, and now is just really taking all of that and showing that it's going to continue and executing. So I think that's been the biggest learning, really, the willingness to transition through the whole sort of pandemic and everything that's happened, and now just see that sort of continue will be really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Who in sustainability, who inspires you? Where do you get your knowledge from? Who are you reading? What kind of articles are you finding?
The one book that I've read recently, which I really enjoyed, was it's actually shared to me by someone I know, one of the founders of All Seated, an Israeli startup, and it's the Israeli book Startup Nation. So that's definitely one that I would recommend. Other than that, gosh, I have a few different subscriptions to obviously things like Google News feeds, and Techstars have a pretty good sustainability blog that runs. I like to touch into that quite regularly, but otherwise it's really just anything that pops up, trying to have a good active following on LinkedIn as well, sort of really keeping eyes on people that you like in the industry. That helps to bring things up into the perspective. Other than that, I think the big one from my side is I'm actually not reading as much as I want to in the last couple of months, because I have my second child on the way with the due date anytime the next sort of 2-3 weeks. So it's been a little bit more reshuffling furniture at home than reading things from a professional perspective.
Well, good luck with that, and I hope you get the opportunity to read some more books. I love Audible because it's there in the background, and I find it much easier. But thank you so much for your time. I take it people can just reach out to you on LinkedIn. I'm going to tag you, if anyone wants to find out more about Thrust Carbon and about calculating their carbon, they can reach out to you on LinkedIn, right?
Absolutely. Always, everyone's welcome to reach out. Always happy to have a conversation with anybody in that respect.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really insightful. Thanks, Glenn.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Bye.